Moi, ich bin Jenna Liberatore. Ich lese mir heute für aus meinem neuesten Buch, The Confines of Eden. Das Buch handelt Mascha, eine junge Ballerina, die in Russland am Anfang des 20. Jahrhunderts lebt. Und es geht seine Geschichte und noch ein bisschen die Geschichte von seinem Bruder, den an der Leibgarde vom Zar noch einen Platz kriegt. Das Buch fand er für zu lehnen an der Bibliothéik und für zu kafen am Ernster oder über Amazon. It is in times of sorrow that you realize how much those close to you really mean to you. It is then that you wish you'd had more time, that you'd gotten to know the person better, known their story. Masha stopped in front of the little blue house with the grey shutters and gazed at it, reminiscing images of the past. It had been a while, but it still looked the same. The heavy wooden door she and Sasha had carved their names in, the curtains her grandmother had made herself, as if it were just yesterday that she left, her grandfather waving her off. A woman she did not know opened the door and smiled at her. "You must be the granddaughter. Your brother told us you were coming." The young girl's eyes immediately fell on two little girls hovering in the corner by the fireplace, his other children. The eldest, who looked to be about 13, was tall and gawky. Long dark gold hair flowed over her back and framed a round face with high cheekbones and a snub nose. She looked at Masha shyly, half expectantly. Masha had known about them. He told them 7 years ago, when the second one was born. The youngest sister clung to the older girl and blinked at Masha, her sky-blue eyes growing big with curiosity. She was the spitting image of her father. Masha turned away, her lips pressed together to form a thin line. The woman had been studying her and nodded encouragingly. "Your sisters waited a long time to meet you," she said. Masha jerked almost imperceptibly and ignored the comment. "I came from my grandfather," she replied dryly and lifted her chin. The stranger stared back at her with a placid face. Masha stepped up and she moved aside to let her in. The girls did not move. Masha turned to the stranger and demanded, "Please take me to him." She followed the woman to a room at the end of the narrow corridor. "Why is he here?" Masha wanted to know. "His bedroom is upstairs." The woman stopped and turned around to her, fixing her. "It's easier if he has his quarters downstairs," she explained. Her tone was not hostile, but it was not friendly either. Masha suddenly blushed. The door to her grandmother's old sewing room was open, and she could hear her grandfather breathing. Her heart pounded against her chest. She was anxious and at the same time scared of what she would find. Hesitating, she stopped at the door. A rustling sound came from the room, and Masha realized her grandfather was clearing his throat. Slowly she walked in, feeling as though her feet were weighing her down. When she saw him lying in his bed, her heart sank. His face was grey, his cheeks sunken in. Fyodor Borodin looked up at the sound of her footsteps, and his face lit up. "Masha," he hushed. She hurried to the bed, took his hand in hers, and pressed it against her cheek. "Grandfather," she whispered. "You grew into a pretty young lady," her grandfather went on, and she was interrupted, "You grew into a pretty young lady," her grandfather went on, and was interrupted by another wave of coughing. She forced a smile and squeezed his hand, fighting back tears. "Oh, don't look so dreadful," the old man hushed. "I'm a sick man. I'm supposed to look bad." "You don't look bad, grandfather," Masha replied, half smiling. "I'll get better, you'll see." There was a pause, and Masha knew what her grandfather was about to ask her. "So, did you meet your sisters?" "They're not my sisters. I have a brother," she answered stubbornly. The young girl looked about, trying to figure out if her grandfather had everything he needed. Her eyes rested on his glass of water as the old man went on. "Despite what you might think of your father, he always did the right thing by you and Sasha." "You defend him because he was your son," Masha put in. her fingers fidgeting the bed cover. I know he loved you and your brother as much as he loved those girls. They're all by themselves now, with no one to look after them. They need someone. Who's that woman who opened the door? Masha asked, hoping to change the subject. Her name is Anya. She's the girl's great-aunt. They were living with her, but I asked her to bring them here. Masha's mouth gaped open. Her grandfather fixed her almost defiantly, but instead of asking why he had done that, she took a deep breath and said, I would like to meet with your doctor in the morning, and I'll write Sasha that I have arrived. I'm going to be staying for a while and look after you until you're better. Her grandfather frowned. Stay? Don't your classes start again in a month? They do, Masha acknowledged. Then you need to be in Moscow. Masha shook her head. I graduated school in June, remember? I'm no longer a boarding student. I'll just take the train to Moscow every morning. It's an hour's ride, the old man muttered. Masha smiled at him. Don't worry, grandfather. I'll be fine. Fyodor nodded. Sasha told me you have an important examination coming up. You will not miss it, nor fail because of me. I won't, Masha promised, and stroked the old man's long, wrinkly fingers. Don't ever abandon your dreams, Fyodor added softly, his eyelids suddenly feeling heavy. Always know what you want, and work hard to get it. Yes, Masha whispered. The old man looked at her with big eyes, as if she had only just appeared at his side, and blinked. Now let me rest, he said. I need some sleep. The great-aunt fussed in the kitchen, while the two girls were still sitting by the fireplace. They fell silent when Masha entered the room. Her gaze briefly rested on them, but then the young girl turned away and went into the kitchen. Thank you for looking after my grandfather, Masha said hesitantly. The woman nodded silently. Do you need any help? Well, you could sit with those girls and take their mind off their sick grandfather, but I suppose you won't do that. Masha's cheeks burned up and her expression hardened. I'm going to go and get my room ready then. There is no room for you, the woman quickly interjected. You have to share the guest room with your sisters. The guest room, Masha called out, raising her brow. I have my own room upstairs, she added derisively. The woman laughed out. All of the second floor hasn't been inhabited in years, she sneered. There's old furniture clogging up the rooms. Masha felt a sting in her chest. She suddenly realized that she had been away too long. Nothing would ever be as it was before. She held the great-aunt's eyes until the elder woman turned away, shaking her head, then went to unpack. The children's clothes lay all round. Shoes formed a path to the big bed. Suddenly angry, Masha stormed about the room, collecting everything and tossing it into one corner of the room in a frenzy. These are new shoes, a voice suddenly said behind her. Masha gasped and whirled around. The two girls were standing in the threshold. The older one had her brows raised dubiously, while the other little girl smiled politely. Masha looked from one to the other, confused. What? The shoes, the little girl with the dark hair said, and pointed at the pair Masha was holding. My mom made them for me when she was still alive. I have never used them. Masha blinked at the shoes. They are very nice, she muttered. But you're crumpling them, the girl replied in an offended tone. It was only then that Masha realized they were ballet shoes. You're a ballet girl? She asked. I want to be. I was supposed to start last February. Papa always promised to enroll me for my 7th birthday, but then he died and I didn't. She explained this so matter-of-factly that Masha gaped at her, stunned. He bought her the shoes when she was 2, the other girl explained. There was a pause in which Masha stared at the soft leather shoes, tears burning her eyes. Lara is a dancer, the child went on. Masha briefly glanced at the taller girl, who blushed slightly and kept her eyes on the floor. Her real name is Larissa, but she hates it. Everyone calls her Lara. She's the best in her class. All the other girls are jealous of her. One day she's going to make it to the Bolshoi." "Stop," Laura put in. The little girl ignored her and asked Masha, "You are a ballet girl too, right?" Masha nodded. "Grandfather told us. He says you'll be great one day." A lump suddenly formed in the young girl's throat. She turned away and continued tidying the room, regardless of the girls. She had hoped they left, but when she was done, she noticed the younger one was still standing there. Masha hesitated, then asked, "What's your name?" "Daria," the girl answered with a smile. Masha took a deep breath. "Look, I'm sure you're a nice girl. You're just not someone I want to get to know. I came to see my grandfather, and when he's better, I'm leaving again. He and my brother are the only family I have." Daria blinked at her, and Masha saw that she was fighting tears. She suddenly felt bad because the girl was just a child, and she was obviously hurt, but she did not want to apologize and say she did not mean it. All she wanted was for them to be gone. She turned her back to Daria and waited until her footsteps echoed in the hallway. Then she breathed a sigh of relief. Alexander came at the end of the summer, when the days were shorter and the sun cast down a pale light and a fading warmth. Her brother had grown his hair and lost the beard that had made him look so old-fashioned and mature. He was 6 years older than her, but sometimes when he grinned, she found he still looked like a boy. Fyodor's state seemed to have stabilized, though he was still weak. The doctor told them he would probably never walk again, which was why Sasha ordered a wheelchair, but no matter how much he and Masha pressed him, he refused to get out of bed. He did insist on having his 4 grandchildren around him, and Masha found she had never felt lonelier. She did not fit into the picture of a happy family. She loved her grandfather, she was grateful that he was alive, but she did not feel at home. Sasha noticed that his sister was absent-minded and discontented. He saw how she avoided the children, how she preferred being alone rather than in a room with them. "I want to show you something," he told her one morning. Masha followed him upstairs, intrigued, and stopped at the top of the stairwell. Her brother turned around to her in surprise and raised his brows. "What is it?" "Nothing, it's just that I haven't been here since—" "It's all right," Sasha said in a soothing voice. He led the way to the old music room, and Masha carefully stepped in. It smelled of wood and dust. A path had been cleared to the grand piano. "I thought it was time for you to play again. I know you'd want to." She felt as though she could not breathe. How long had she not played? Masha shook her head. "I can't," she whispered. "He died a long time ago," Alexander put in quietly. "Just play. It will ease your mind." Layers of dust covered the black glass paint. Masha carefully ran a finger over the ivory keys, pushing one down slowly. The sound was pristine, as if this beautiful instrument had never been sleeping for so long up here. Masha slowly sat down and placed her hand over the keyboard. Suddenly, her fingers moved on their own, producing a melody she had not heard in so long that it sent shivers through her body. Her beloved Chopin. Sasha watched her and noticed how she gradually lost herself, how she loosened up and turned into a different girl. She closed her eyes when she played and bobbed her head from one side to the other, along with the melody. When she finished, Masha took in a deep breath. She stroked the keys, and the hint of a smile curled her lips. Then she looked up at her brother. "It's not those girls' fault he's gone," Sasha said, and started out the room, with Masha staring after him. The house smelled of fresh paint. When, during the spring, the windows were open and the breeze floated inside, it carried that smell, along with the scent of flowers and new grass. The hardwood floors had been polished. They creaked even under the lightest footsteps. Masha's room had 3 large windows, one of which was built into a bay she used as a reading corner. It overlooked the front garden, where she and her sisters had planted roses and lavender in the summer. A cherry tree threw part of its shadow into her room. Masha had fixed a swing to it. The cast iron door clinked. Masha looked up from her book and saw her sisters walk along the path towards the front door. Their faces were flushed from the chill air, announcing that they had left yet another summer behind, their second in St. Petersburg. She heard Fyodor's voice from downstairs as he greeted the girls. They spoke French with him now, but he stubbornly replied in Russian every time, triggering a smirk on their little faces. Daria no longer wanted to hear stories about poor farmer girls. Instead, she told Fyodor the ones she learned at school, about princes and princesses, kings and empresses. Lara was not just a girl anymore. She ran around the house carrying a pile of books on her head to improve her posture. She asked Masha to take her shopping on Nevsky Prospect and to have tea at the English salon. She talked about balls and receptions and already planned her debutante ball. It did this to you, the city, change you. It cast a spell and spread out its arms, opening up for you a world of magic and possibilities. It was what Fyodor feared it would do, but even though Masha was aware that it absorbed her, that it converted her soul, she found nothing more exciting and thrilling. In St. Petersburg, she had been promoted to second soloist. In St. Petersburg, she got to dance for the Tsar. There was a controversy about him. While his name was uttered with awe and admiration among the ballerinas, people of the outside world spoke of him with disdain. Poverty, famine, discontentment, they called him weak and unfit, unable to live up to the grandeur of his father. Voices said Russia was slowly crumbling down. But Masha chose to ignore those stories. She felt a flutter when the Tsar's name fell. She dreamed of one day being a first dancer, his first dancer, and dance for him in his theater at the Winter Palace. She wanted to please him and anyone else who attended the ballets at the Imperial Theater. Many came every night. They filled the boxes and first stalls, eager to see the dancers shine in performances staged to entertain them during the long days of winter. They were the ones holding a dancer's future in their hands, Masha had learned. They had the power to lift them up to the highest pedestal, but they could also push them down and cast them into the dark pit of oblivion. Count Alexei Antonov noticed her before any of the other men did. He had asked to be introduced to the cast of the Nutcracker when it was featured the previous year. Masha had still been a coryphée then. No one had paid attention to her, except him. The Count had spent the following weeks sending flowers to Masha's dressing room, but then, after Lent, he had left for his summer residence. She wondered whether he was still interested in her, or if he would pursue someone else this season. She hoped he would not. Count Antonov was a handsome man, and he knew how to draw a woman's gaze. His long hair gave him a venturous look. His hazel eyes were dreamy. "Looks don't matter," Rosalina remarked. "Just like love, this is not a matter of the heart, it's business." Masha glanced at her through the mirror while applying rouge to her cheeks. She was intimidated by her ruthlessness, which Rosalina attributed to her experience. "I know that," Masha replied as she dipped the cotton pad into the powder box. It was the opening night at the Imperial Ballet. The Tsar was expected to attend their performance of Swan Lake, and for the first time in her career, Masha was one of the big swans. She was hoping to see Count Antonov again and imagined that he would come just for her. Rosalina scrutinized her friend and found she did not believe her. In her delicately embroidered costume and feathered tutu, Masha looked fragile and innocent. "You don't have to fall in love with him, just make yourself interesting enough that he doesn't get bored with you." "I don't know how this works," Masha admitted quietly. "The first time is always awkward," Rosalina told her. "But once you're past it, you'll feel at ease, you'll see. Just remember that feelings have no place here. They can ruin you." Sasha's feet crunched on the cobbled pavement as he crossed the garden of the Winter Palace and headed to the arched entrance leading onto Palace Square. He could hear the engine of a car running and heard the faint voices of the Tsar and Tsaritsa as they prepared to go to the theater. Sasha was not one of those guards who got to accompany the members of the imperial family. He had not been chosen as a bodyguard, a fact that sometimes still disappointed him. He had heard the voices coming closer but turned around only when he heard the giggling. 4 young girls walked together in rows of twos and were looking at him curiously. During the past year, he had only rarely crossed the Grand Duchess's path, and, not able to contain his own interest, Sasha stared back at them. The younger girls, still children, formed the rear. The first was chubby and her movements were plump, but her face was beautiful. She smiled at Sasha with rosy cheeks and kind eyes. The younger girl's traits were gruffer. She stared at him bluntly with an air of impishness in her eyes and a grin on her lips. The young man could not help but grin back a little, much to the child's delight. Then Sasha's gaze wandered to the two older girls. They looked to be about 15, tall and lanky, but displaying the first signs of their blooming into young women. It was the eldest that struck Alexander the most. Her long oval face was almost porcelain-like. Her features were soft, yet she seemed reserved. Only her eyes gave her away, deep blue pits spilling out like a quiet sea. It was only when they had almost passed him that Sasha realized he had not bowed to them. He blushed a deep crimson and clumsily inclined himself, earning puffy giggles in response. "He must be new," one of the girls said in an amused voice. Sasha looked up at them in surprise and saw that the eldest Grand Duchess glanced over her shoulder and smiled at him before her sister reached up to her and turned her head around. The voice of a woman resonated inside one of the hallways at the Winter Palace as Sasha crossed it. He slowed down his pace and listened, and it was not until he had come closer that he recognized it was the Tsaritsa talking to her husband. "I don't like it here," she was complaining. "We are much happier at Tsarskoye Selo." "Yes, we are," the Tsar agreed in a soft voice. "Then can we please go back?" His wife pleaded. "The Winter Palace is the official residence of our family. We haven't been living here for years. People are starting to talk." "Let them," the Tsaritsa countered in a somewhat sharper tone. "You have said yourself that you prefer being away from the city, away from people." "I mean it," Sasha heard the Tsar reply soothingly. "Nothing makes me happier than to be with my family, far from the scrutiny of my subjects. Just be a little more patient, my dear." The Tsaritsa sighed under her breath. "We could have gone to Livadia, but before you went off to hunt," she said in a nostalgic tone. "Just the 7 of us." "Maybe next fall then," the Tsar promised. Sasha quietly sneaked past the room with the half-open door, and the voices ebbed down as he went away. The Tsaritsa did not have a good reputation among her people. They thought she was cold and aloof, and probably her wanting to seclude her and her family away from Peter did not help things further. He had crossed her path a couple of times over the last year, but she had always ignored him, conceding not even a formal greeting, just as she did not pay attention to the rest of the servants. At first he had thought she was just being unfriendly, but then Sasha started to believe that other people's presence made her uncomfortable, and that she wished them away, choosing on purpose not to see them, with the hopes that maybe they would indeed vanish into thin air like ghosts. All of a sudden, a door opened a few yards ahead of Sasha, and the slim figure of a young girl slipped into the hall. He stopped and stared at her, just as she turned her head and saw him. It was Olga, the eldest of the Grand Duchesses. Their eyes held for only a second, but to Sasha it felt as if time stood still. Her blonde hair was pulled out of her face on both sides and held there with a comb. It fell down her back in lush waves. She was wearing a pearl necklace, which underlined her delicate neck, and a light pink dress. Her thin lips formed a smile, which Sasha eagerly returned. He was suddenly overwhelmed by the urge to close the distance between them and talk to her. For the fraction of an instant, he forgot who she was and started towards her when he was snapped back into reality as 3 other girls stepped out behind her. Sasha paused. "Remember to read the next 5 chapters for tomorrow," a man called out from the room in French. Anastasia curled her nose and skipped ahead of her sisters. Olga brushed a strand of hair behind her ear and threw Sasha a shy glance before she turned her back to him and followed the other girls. The teacher shot out of the classroom, a pile of coats on his left arm, and ran after the 4 sisters. "Your coats! You'll catch a cold if you go out like this." Sasha stepped by the window and waited. The hallway had a view of the principal garden, established in the courtyard of the Winter Palace, the one accessible to the public. The Tsaritsa had another garden, built beneath the private wing of the palace, away from Kira's eyes. He was hoping the Grand Duchesses would choose to take a stroll in the public garden, but the only person he saw was an old man leaning on a cane. Then, suddenly, a figure walked through the arched entrance. Sasha held his breath when he recognized Olga. She walked slowly, looking around inconspicuously, before she stopped almost exactly beneath his window and looked up, her eyes quickly scanning the windows. When she spotted Sasha, she smiled triumphantly. His heart started pounding against his chest. Should he go downstairs? Was that why she had come by herself, or had she just wanted to see whether he was still there? "This is silly," he thought. "I'm not a schoolboy anymore." Yet he felt like one as he hurried outside. His footsteps resonated on the marble floors, and Sasha had to force himself not to run, and thus attract someone's attention. He realized he might lose his job if Olga's parents discovered what he was doing. The crisp air chilled his burning cheeks as he caught up with the young girl. She was sitting on the edge of a fountain, a book in her lap. When she heard him approaching, Olga peered at him out of the corner of her eye. Sasha's gaze fell on the old man, who was apparently oblivious that one of the Grand Duchesses was in the garden. He waved his cane at some pigeons, which had settled down in front of him on the path and were picking the ground. Olga's sapphire blue eyes glistened excitedly when she looked at him. He stopped in front of her, unsure of what he should do next. "What's your name?" the young girl asked. "Alexander Nikolaevich Borodin," Sasha answered. Olga chuckled, amused by his serious tone. "And what can I call you?" she wanted to know, studying him boldly. "My family and friends call me Sasha." The young girl seemed satisfied. "Will you sit with me, Sasha?" she asked, and patted the spot next to hers. He hesitated and looked around to make sure no one else could see them. Then he checked on the old man, who was walking at a distance now and probably could not tell who they were. Sasha sat down next to Olga, leaving enough space between them that their encounter remained decent. His gaze fell on the window where he had been standing 20 minutes ago, then roamed to the right, where the Tsaritsa and the Tsar had been discussing matters in one of their private rooms. Sasha felt a knot in his stomach. "Maman did not like for people to stare at the windows of our private apartments," Olga explained. "That's why she had the other garden built. Also, she didn't want us to feel observed when we played outside." "It is a good thought," Sasha conceded, still avoiding looking at the young girl. Olga laid her book aside and turned to him. "Are you married?" He raised his brows. "What? Beg your pardon, Your Highness?" She giggled. "Don't call me that." Sasha looked at her then and was struck by her beauty. The large forehead, the fine eyebrows, high cheekbones and a dimple in her round chin. "I'm not married," he said quietly. Their eyes locked and he thought about kissing her. She leaned forward a little and cast down her eyes, her lips forming a faint smile, when Sasha suddenly broke away. "I should go," he muttered. Her eyelids fluttered open and she stared at him with a mix of astonishment and disbelief. Sasha rose to his feet and glanced at the palace uneasily. He almost expected to find the Tsaritsa at one of the windows, striking him with a deadly look. Olga stood silently and walked away without a word. He watched her and stifled the urge to run after her. Her shoulders and back looked slender in the dark grey wool coat. The tips of her hair teetered from one side to the other. Sasha watched the young girl until she was swallowed by the imposing walls of the winter palace. Opportunities are like rare flowers. They need to be seized before they wilt. If you take a leap, if you take that chance, they can make fruits and turn into something lasting. Masha knew that. It was one of the things her father had taught her. She had one disadvantage, which was that she was skinny. Men did not like girls with slender figures. She had to make up for that by the way she danced. In her 4th week at Krasnoye Selo, Masha got to dance the fairy godmother in Cinderella, a piece staged by the great Marius Petipa back in 1893. Then the unexpected happened. The first dancer fell ill and could no longer perform. The stage was clear for someone else to shine and bewitch the crowd, and the Tsar. The naive girl thought the part was hers because, as a first soloist, she had earned the next best part. Svobodov would not hesitate to choose her. But the reality was that she hadn't won yet. He could pick any of the other first soloists, and she was disappointed when Svobodov picked out girls he wanted to see in an audition. While he was impressed with Masha, there was one other girl that piqued his interest. Masha saw it in the way he followed her with his eyes, his lips halfway curled into a smile. Her stomach tied into a knot. What if he picked her? After the audition, Masha hung back and waited for the others to leave. Then she turned on her heels and started towards Svobodov. "Have you decided who to choose for the part?" she asked in a meek voice. Svobodov looked at her, surprised. "You think I have made my choice already?" The young woman flinched. If he had not, it meant that none of the girls had stood out. It meant that she had not been good enough. Svobodov noticed the sour expression on her face and smiled complacently. "Are you here to ask me something?" She held his gaze, but suddenly felt sick. Svobodov laughed softly and looked her up and down. "The part of a prima ballerina is not to be taken lightly. You have to be at this level with every fiber of your body. Wanting the part badly is not enough." Masha swallowed. "I know you're a hard worker," Svobodov conceded. "But the fact is that today I saw 2 girls that I liked, so I will split the part. You and Svetlana will both dance Cinderella." Masha stared. Svobodov saw that she was not satisfied and smirked. "It's better to share the fame than to stay in the shadows," he told her. The girls took their place in one of the windows of the upper floor, pushing and making room for themselves, eager to have the best spot so that they could be seen from outside. Pink streaks divided the fading blue sky, their curves as gentle as if they had been applied with a paintbrush. While the theater was buzzing with light chatter, all of the artists waited in front of the imperial entrance for the clattering sound of horse hoofs or the humming of the engine as the Tsar and his court pulled up in their troikas and cars. When the imperial party arrived, the girls hushed and stayed outside, holding their breaths. The girl standing next to Masha pushed her to the side, but Masha blocked her off with her shoulder, spread her feet, and stood like a stone. No one would take her spot, not this time. The artist saluted the Tsar, who looked up at the middle window and nodded curtly with an impassive face. Masha heard some of the others snort in contempt. One sneered that the Tsar looked as if he were forced to enter the theater. But then his gaze drifted to the left, and for the fraction of a moment it met Masha's. Her heart skipped a beat. Keen eyes standing out in a bearded face. She remembered them grazing her once before. The corners of the Tsar's mouth twitched upwards a little, and she thought she saw him nod again, just for her. Masha dared to imagine he had recognized her. Dat war het.